bugging your faculty if you don't think you are on these, okay? So next week will be the book club. Our speaker for today is Professor Jesse Markay. One of our own. Jesse teaches in the history department here at Sonoma State University. And before that, he was an instructor at the University of New Mexico. Is that right, Jesse? Awesome. He is an expert primarily in U.S. history, correct? Right? Sorry? I know something about it. We don't know a bit about it. He grounds his teaching in texts that are very diverse. For instance, the hip-hop musical Hamilton is one of his favorite texts he's as a teacher. And he's used, for instance, the autobiography of President Obama, which, is kind of an interesting way to go, too. His PhD work has been at the University of New Mexico, and he holds degrees from Skidmore College and UCLA. He's a huge volunteer in our community, a real mentor, a real good person to go to for advice if we want to serve our community. All right, so please give a huge FYE welcome to Professor Jesse Markay.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, everybody. I'm going to speak today about history and our identities. And I don't want to disappoint anybody, but I'm not going to be referring to lots of dates and places. I am going to, just so that you have some perspective, I am going to give you some dates of when people were born and so on, but that's not really the important stuff of what I want to talk about. What I am going to speak about is meant to offer a different perspective on history with the hope that you could consider history in a much more personal way than you probably have in the past. Okay. My argument actually is pretty simple. History is a powerful tool to assess and create our identities. It is a place in which we can challenge and even reform ourselves. And I think there are many ways in which this is true. Oh, and I'm going to put these slides up too, so I know I'm probably going to go pretty quickly, but the slides will be up just in case anybody's dying to revisit this. I'm going to address three ways that I think history relates to personal identity. First, history, just as in great literature, provides us with characters and circumstances that can fuel our imaginations. One historian called this the historical imagination, the process of placing ourselves in the shoes of someone else, informed and limited by what historical research and sources uncover. It's also something that a couple Wednesdays ago Scott Miller was referring to when he spoke about how stories have helped him create his identity. It's the same thing about history. Second, history reveals different ways of understanding concepts that we take for granted. And I'm going to refer to one in particular, to a phrase we often hear today, and that is that a person is self-made. The way that our ancestors thought about being self-made is different than the way we generally think about it, and it closely relates to our study of personal identity. And third, I want to consider the question of just who tells your story. And I want to reflect on what it would mean to live without a history, or to live with a history that was distorted in such a way that it would lead to an internalized sense of inferiority. As I heard Professor Romsberg say the other day, you can't value your history until you know it. And I think that's a big part of what I want to speak about. Now, maybe I should clarify just what I mean when I speak about history. I suggested an essay for this week called "Every Man is His Own Historian" by Carl Becker, who was an important historian from the early part of the 20th century. And he distinguished what actually occurred from another meaning, what he called knowledge of history. And this is how he defined history in that sense, that history is the memory of things said and done. And that's what we usually mean when we speak about doing history or studying history, not the actual events, but the way we recall them. And here's another way of thinking about history, one that I bet every history professor at one time or another has used, and that is that history is the study of change over time. Time is the essential dimension of history, and it seems pretty obvious that if things never changed, then there wouldn't really be any need for history. And here's my own personal definition, and it's the reason that I love history. History is the story of real people in real time and in real places. Now, if the section that I have the joy of meeting with on Tuesdays and Thursdays is any indication, you are already historians. Just reflect back on the soundtrack of your life. Almost all of you told your stories as they unfolded over time, telling us what your lives were like when you were an infant and all the way through the time that you're here at Sonoma State. You could have done it other ways. You could have just referred to what you're doing today around you right now, but you seem to understand intuitively that the memory of what you have said and done reveals something significant about who you are today. And that's doing history as Carl Becker understood it. You had a problem to solve. You had to produce an introduction of yourself that was put to music. You checked your sources. You looked at photos. You looked through music. You thought about what was going on. You might have looked back at a yearbook or two. Maybe you spoke to somebody else. Maybe you checked out with your parents. You know, what was I doing when I was 3 or 4 years old? What was I like? And then you told your story, and that's all that history is, as Carl Becker understood it. But what I want to do now is address the first of those ways in which the study of history might help us define our identity, and that's through the use of historical imagination. And I walked off without my money. Does anybody have a $10 bill I could borrow? Ben, thanks. That's quick. Thank you. You're welcome. All right. So, who's this guy? Who's the guy on the $10 bill? Yeah. I promise I'll give this back then. Yeah, it's Hamilton. It's Alexander Hamilton. Do any of you know the musical Hamilton? Scott just referred to the fact that I often use it when I'm teaching history. Do any of you know it? A couple of you do. I know when I talk to students, some of them play the soundtrack all the time, and it is really a pretty remarkable phenomenon. The attention Hamilton has received is nothing like anything in my lifetime. A year after it opened on Broadway, people are still willing to pay unbelievable amounts of money for tickets. And it is a hip-hop musical based on a huge biography written about Hamilton. And who could have imagined turning the biography of one of those old dead founding fathers into this really mind-blowing work of art? And it's written and created and thought of, and the music's from, and he starred in it by a guy named LinManuel Miranda. And I say without any fear of contradiction that he's an absolute creative genius. And what he wanted to do was recreate the world of revolutionary America where real, complex, flawed human beings lived. Dr. Ostroff, a couple weeks ago, spoke about how we are constantly changing and adapting. And those are the kinds of people that Miranda has depicted. And Miranda, who is the son of Puerto Rican immigrants, wanted to tell the quintessential immigrant story because Hamilton, after all, is an immigrant. And through his music and his rhymes, Miranda did this in such a way that the audience can't help but imagining that they are a part of this world, part of revolutionary America, part of the early republic. So just for the purposes of some background about the song, so it means something, who was Hamilton? Anybody, what comes to mind when you think of Hamilton? Anybody? I'm sorry? All right, well, most people, and I bet if you reach down in there, you'd remember this too. Most people know how he died. I mean, that's the highlight, perhaps, in some people's minds of his story. But he had a pretty amazing life. He was born in 1755 on the Caribbean island of Nevis. His mother was trapped in a legal system that was completely unsympathetic to women, and that's where the constant references to Hamilton as a bastard son of a whore come from. His mother died when he was young, and the wealthy planters of Nevis, impressed by his intelligence and the efforts he made to improve himself, took up a collection, and they sent him to the mainland, and he arrived in New York in 1772. And he was, in the words of the song I hope we're about to hear, another immigrant coming up from the bottom. So again, just so the song makes a little bit of sense, Hamilton came to New York, quickly started agitating against the British before the Revolution. He became George Washington's most senior aide during the war. He played a major role in writing the Constitution, and an even more important role in getting it ratified by writing a majority of the Federalist Papers. He was the first Secretary of the Treasury, and he has been called both the father of American government and the father of the American financial system. But it's the end of his life that he's probably best known for, or at least up until the time that Miranda wrote Hamilton. Hamilton was killed in a duel in 1804 at the hands of the Vice President, Aaron Burr. Think about that. The Vice President of the United States killed the former Secretary of the Treasury, just in case anybody thinks that the politics of today are uniquely brutal. So what I want to play is the first song from Hamilton, and each of the historical characters introduces Hamilton, and you can see the names of the character who's singing that is there in capital letters and brackets. So let's see if I can do this. So meditate for 20 seconds, and let me just I know, I'm getting up there in years, and I've heard this song 1,000, maybe 950 times, but it's still, I don't know, it still gives me chills. So I mean, what is that about? What is that? And I recognize that your history textbooks don't have the same beats and rhythms and rhymes that Hamilton has. And there are legitimate questions about Miranda's portrayal of Hamilton. I mean, things that you'd talk about in a history class, and his portrayal of the early republic. But Hamilton is history. And I would argue that a great deal of its impact is that the narrative compels the audience to place themselves in the shoes of the historical characters, to engage in historical imagination. The audience wonders what it would be like to be an immigrant who arrives in New York, a place where you can be a new man. They wonder if they would be up to the challenges of the Revolution and the years of the early Republic. They wonder what it would be like to be women like the Schuyler sisters, the love interests of Hamilton, who felt the weight of the limitations they lived under, but who had faith that someday they might get the opportunity for fulfillment and achievement. And the audience imagines what it would be like to be challenged to a duel, to participate in what was called an affair of honor, when all you had to do was simply retract something that you had said. In other words, the history that Miranda presents so powerfully in Hamilton affords us an arena to test ourselves, to reflect on who we are and who we might be by using historical imagination. And I personally know that the historical imagination can be life-changing, because that's just what happened to me. Some time ago, well after I had earned my BA in political science, and I thought I was done with school, I found myself reading a history of the civil rights era. I was reading about the sit-ins that began in 1960. And here you see a picture of a couple young whites, of black women and some whites, their allies, sitting at a lunch counter. This happens to be in Jackson, Mississippi in 1963. And you see the toughs of the town standing behind them, pouring ketchup and mustard and syrup and putting out cigarettes on their backs. Have any of you read Coming of Age in Mississippi? Okay, Steve. And this woman right in here, I can't see from the corner, that's Anne Moody, who wrote this really remarkable memoir. It's also a book that I often ask my students to read, and I think that you'd all find very compelling. And I was reading about the freedom rides of 1961, when young blacks and whites, and some not so young people, got on buses. They were trying to desegregate interstate transport. Here you see a picture of their bus, one of the buses outside of Anniston, Alabama, that was set on fire by the Ku Klux Klan. And I was writing about the Birmingham campaign in 1963 in Alabama, which was pretty much led by, it was called the Children's March. It was led by young people, by middle school students, by high school students, even younger. And here you see these really these unforgettable images of police dogs being loosed on young African Americans, and pictures of fire hoses. They were all part of this too. And I read about the voter registration drives in Mississippi in 1964, and this is a picture of Tom Hayden, at the time, a young man from Michigan who went down to Mississippi to help register African Americans to vote. And I put this up here because Tom Hayden just died a couple days ago. But also, in the same voter registration drive, you had people like Robert Moses, who is, you probably hear me use the word hero a couple more times, but a real hero of mine. I mean, just this incredible bravery coming down from New York and going out into the most dangerous parts of Mississippi to register voters. And I read about the march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965 and Bloody Sunday. And you see here a picture of John Lewis, who was the president of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, being beaten. And they eventually were able to continue on their march from Selma to Montgomery. And John Lewis, another hero of mine, is now a congressman from Georgia. So I was reading all this, and I began to wonder if I could have been capable of doing what these men and women did. Now, I was sure I would have been there in spirit, but I don't know exactly how I would have answered one of the most important questions of the movement, and that was, where's your body? Where I had been ready to risk my safety and even my life. So I wanted to learn more about them and their world and the future they were trying to create. And one thing led to another, and here I am, still trying to figure it out. If nothing else, thinking of them has been humbling and led me to an appreciation of what real courage is. But for sure, historical imagination has dramatically changed who I am. Well, maybe historical imagination doesn't work for everybody, so let me try a second way that history could help fashion a personal identity. And that's through a different way of thinking about being self-made. One of the things that historians do is follow how words have different meanings over time. Some of the concepts we think of as timeless don't mean today what they meant in the past. For instance, historians were instrumental in demonstrating that marriage did not always and forever mean a union between a man and a woman. And another phrase whose meaning has changed over time is self-made. And you know that term. You hear it all the time. I mean, who comes to mind when you think of self-made in the 21st century? What's that? You could say it out loud, it's okay. Jay-Z, sure. Anybody else? I'm sorry? Bill Gates. Okay, maybe. Anybody else? What's that? All right, well, I'm sure each one of you, somewhere down there, you've got somebody in mind. When I spoke with my section, and I did try a couple of these things out with them, my pals, they came up with a couple, and one was Oprah, right? I mean, she started from pretty modest circumstances, and she's one of the richest people in the United States. Beyonce was another that they came up with. Jay-Z, Kanye, and Steve Jobs from Apple. So, and what is it they all have in common? Well, what's interesting, I thought, was that 4 of those folks were people of color, but all 5 of them have something in common. I mean, it's why people thought of them. Well, what's that? What do they have in common? They're rich. They made a lot of money. And that's what we think about being self-made. It means you started with very little money and now you have lots of money. That's what we think about being self-made. But it had a different meaning in the past. In colonial America, that's before the American Revolution, it was generally accepted that your life was determined by the circumstances you found yourself in at birth. There was little chance that you could change your social status. And here's a portrait from 1748, about 27 years before the Revolution. And what do you think this guy is trying to tell you about himself? And it's not like this is a selfie, right? I mean, he went to a lot of trouble. He didn't walk down the street and say, hey, could you paint my portrait? I mean, he paid a lot of money. And so what does he want you to think about him? What's that? What's he got on? What's he wearing on? What's he got on his head? He's got a wig. And these clothes, I don't know if you can see them really well, but they're fine silk. He came from London, fine silk. And his hands are being held in a special way, a sort of an affected way. Do you think he's got printer's ink? Do you think he's got dirt underneath his fingernails? Probably not. Do you think he thought he was an American, or do you think he thought he was British? Well, what does he look like? British. Well, the fact is, I know a little bit about who this is. He lived in America for lots of his life, but just as most people did in 1748, in living in America, in the colonies, he thought of himself as British for sure. So there's that image that he wanted to portray. So let me as I say, I know a little bit about him. he was one of the very few who actually could be considered a gentleman, despite not being born to the upper class. So he wasn't born, this is a picture of a gentleman. He wants to portray himself as an elite. But he had managed to earn enough money that he could retire at the age of 42, and he had been around enough to have picked up the manners of the genteel. But becoming a gentleman was very rare at that time. It's not as if there were a test that you had to pass, but there were very definite and accepted standards. And even then, one of the worst things you could be was to be a poser. So it was important that he really be a gentleman to look like one. So this guy's really unusual in the colonial era. And then the revolution began in 1775, and there are historians who argue that the real radical change brought by the revolution, more than any kind of political change, was the freedom to make of yourself what you wished. And it belonged to everyone. Well, at least if you were a white male. And over time, too slowly for sure, and still not completely, that model came to include women and people of color. In the late 18th century and through the 19th century, Americans frequently spoke about the importance of constructing oneself properly. They pointed to individuals that they called self-made men. They weren't talking about people getting rich. They weren't talking about people whose self made money, but of actually making who they were. They made a self. They made their self. They believed that individuals were valuable in their own right and that they could develop their full potential if they worked on themselves. You had the right to decide what kind of person you wanted to be, and they believed in self-improvement, self-development, and working to fulfill one's potential. And it is essentially what Thomas Jefferson meant when he included the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence as one of the inalienable rights. And in these Wednesday lectures, you've heard about some of the ways that our identities are acted on by outside forces. Professor Acosta-Lewis spoke of the power of advertising and media. And Professor Ostroff a couple weeks ago spoke of forces that shape us, and we're not even aware of them. Professor Shaw asked if we were really free to choose the roles that we act out in our lives. And Professor Switke and Professor McEwen argued that our identities are bound up with political choices and politics, often in ways that we have little control of. And there's undoubtedly truth in everything they've said, but maybe there's a different way to think of making a self. And I remember a couple words that Professor Romsberg spoke of just last week when he challenged us all to decide and then to act on what kind of person we want to be. And that's the kind of thing I want to talk about. And I'm going to speak about 4 individuals, each of them consciously engaged in a project of self-creation. And each of them outlined a program for others to do the same. Does anybody have a $100 bill? I walked off without all my money. Gina, that's cool. Thanks, Gina. I promise I'll give it back to you. So who's this on the $100 bill? Yeah, it's Ben Franklin, and there's a picture of him on the $100 bill. And so let me tell you a little bit about him. He was born in 1706, 70 years before the Revolution. He was one of 17 children born to a very poor family. But over his life, he managed to cultivate a range of talents in such a way that he truly stands as unique in American history. At one time, he was a printer, an author, a businessman, a scientist, a lobbyist, a legislator, a diplomat, a statesman, and an American oracle. And Franklin was proud of how he had created himself, and Americans held him up as someone to emulate. In his later years, he wrote an autobiography that perhaps some of you have come across. It's one of the classic how-to books that was based on his own life, and many of them based on his own mistakes. And he offered his autobiography as advice on how to develop virtuous habits. And so Franklin consciously practiced and advocated self-construction. He did it because he thought a person with the proper balance of passion and reason would live a socially useful life. He wanted to demonstrate that hard work, honesty, thrift, and humility would lead to success and ultimately personal fulfillment and happiness. So here's a picture. Here's one picture of, so this is a picture of Franklin after the Revolution. And what does he look like? I mean, here's the guy from 1748. What does Franklin look like? He doesn't have a wig on, right? He doesn't seem to be concerned that he's going bald. And his clothes, I mean, you know, he looks kind of frumpy, doesn't he? These aren't fine silks from London. And he doesn't seem too concerned about what he looks like. And he was held up. This actually is based on a portrait that the French loved Franklin before Americans did. And that's this portrait. And the French loved him because Franklin was supposed to be, you know, the American, which meant that, of course, he was very different than the British, who they hated. But Franklin was held up as a hard worker, a guy that worked hard, who worked his way up, and that was going to be the model for Americans. And so that's what was being portrayed in this particular depiction. And just compare it to this guy. I mean, they're very different images, before the Revolution and after the Revolution. So this idea of self-construction is an image that comes after the Revolution. By the way, does anybody know who this is? That happens to be Benjamin Franklin. That's Franklin from 1748, when as soon as he could, the first day he could, he quit working. He earned enough money that he could stop working. And I mean, that's one of the ironies of history, is that Franklin's held up to us as a hardworking everyman, but as soon as he could, he stopped working. Nonetheless, he certainly is that image of self-made. And here's a portrait of Frederick Douglass, another of the self-made men. This is a portrait from about 1847. And just again, really quickly, he was born enslaved in Maryland somewhere around 1822. He wasn't sure of much about his very early life. With some help, but mostly through his own efforts, he learned to read and write. In 1838, Douglass escaped from slavery and he traveled north. And for the rest of his life, he fought first for the abolition of slavery, and during and after the Civil War, he became America's leading speaker and writer in the struggle for equal rights for African Americans. And Douglass also fought for the rights of others, including women. He was an attendee at the Seneca Women's Convention in 1848. He wrote 3 autobiographies. Not only did he create himself, which he clearly did. I mean, he was a slave, and he went on to become one of the most powerful, influential, certainly of the African Americans, but of any Americans in the 19th century. But he also wrote his story. He created his own legend. And the first, published in 1848, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, contains these words, which in my mind are among the most stirring in American literature. They appear just in the middle, where he describes his life as a slave, and then he says, "Now you shall see how a slave was made a man." Douglass here's a picture of him a little bit. I was thinking, there's certain obligatory words that are attached to people, and Douglass is always described as fierce. And you can see that here. I mean, he just looks like a fierce man. He believed that his life and the success he had at self-making would serve as a model for the African American community. And he was driven to develop his own potential to the fullest, and by doing so, he wanted to demonstrate how wrong racism was and to put the lie to any claim that America was a meritocracy if African Americans were going to be excluded. In one of the most popular speeches he made was called Self-Made Men. He made this speech all through the 19th century. And he described what self-made men were, but then he made this interesting statement. He said that self-made men are, in a peculiar sense, indebted to themselves for themselves. And the speech was full of maxims, just like Franklin's was, about how to go on and live a good life. Well, there were, throughout Douglass's life, many who doubted that this ex-slave, this African-American, could do and write and speak as he did. They were sure he was just an actor speaking somebody else's lines. They denied the possibility that a black man, a former slave, could ever change what he was born to be. But Douglass's project of self-creation was a testament to the power of self-making, and it serves as an inspiration to everyone who hears a story of how a slave became a man. And here you see Douglass towards the end of his life. And Abraham Lincoln, you know his story, and I'm just going to mention him very briefly in passing. He also was a self-made man from a very poor family, less than a year of schooling. But he believed in this idea of self-improvement, and he never stopped educating himself. But in a speech he gave in 1838, he argued that since American democracy could never be overthrown by a foreign invader, the only enemy we had to fear was within us, within ourselves. That undisciplined passion was the real danger, and allowing passions to get out of control would lead to mob rule, a warning that seems particularly important 1 week away from the election day. And his political choices, and I won't really describe them in much detail. He was a member of the Whig Party and then the Republican Party, the brand new Republican Party. Both parties developed an improvement to creating conditions where people could improve themselves. And even his most famous words, the Gettysburg Address, are built up, the nation can recreate itself just like we can, just like people can. So Lincoln is certainly a self-made man. And just a couple, from 1846 when he was a congressman, here 1858 when he was in debates with Stephen Douglas, not Frederick Douglass, Stephen Douglas. And here he is when he was being inaugurated. And then you can see what 4 years of war did to him. I mean, this is just 4 years later. But lest you think that it's just Abraham Lincoln that time has any. You see these pictures of Barack Obama, who certainly has aged over time, change over time. And another couple, change we can believe in. And you see, he's aged more than just 8 years. One more self-made man, or this time woman, and that's Jane Addams, another hero of mine. She was born in Illinois in 1860 to a prosperous family. Her future seemed to be destined to be a life of domesticity, but she pursued an education, something that was slowly becoming available to women of means. She went to college, then she began at the Women's Medical School of Philadelphia, but she dropped out. Sounds like a severe bout of depression, probably or perhaps because she wasn't comfortable with who she was at that point. So she traveled to Europe in Britain, and she became acquainted with the settlement house movement, a movement dedicated to helping those in need. And so she made a conscious decision that her personal fulfillment would come from living a life she felt would be socially useful. And that was the beginning of her life of self-creation, of remaking herself. And in Chicago, Addams co-created Hull House with Alan Starr, with whom Addams had a long-term romantic relation. And here's the whole point of the settlement house was to help particularly immigrant women and their children. But Addams believed that aiding women in need was just as important to the people who were helping them as it was to the objects of their assistance. Now here's a photo of Hull House down in Chicago, South Chicago. Here she is at 1915, and here she is towards the end of her life at Hull House again with the children that were getting educated there. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1935. She was a pacifist and worked hard for that. And she was an original and sophisticated thinker. She made important contributions to American philosophy. And she made herself every bit as much as Franklin, Douglass, or Lincoln. But that she was a woman has always been used to diminish who she was. The philosopher William James, who was a friend and admirer of Adams, wrote these words about her, and he meant them as the highest praise. He wrote that she simply inhabits reality, and everything she says necessarily expresses its nature. She can't help writing the truth. Well, he thought that was praise. But if you look at those words, you'll see what has been said of so many women before and since, that what women are, for better or for worse, is what their nature decrees. And those words deny Jane Addams the recognition that she could make herself, that she had made a conscious decision to be who she was, and that it was only through hard work that she became that person. And it's a perspective that unfortunately persists to this day. So there's 4 self-made people, different sense than what we mean today. They were not selves making money. They made their selves as they saw fit. They were representative of a new ideal in America, that you did not have to live with an identity to which you were born, that whether you were a success or not depended on your choices. Well, self-making in that sense is open to debate and criticism, and I suspect that you'll be talking about things like that through your time here at Sonoma State. Nonetheless, I think that there is something to learn from these self-made Americans and a different understanding of making the self. And I want to turn, I swore that I was going to have this time, that I wouldn't be rushing at the end. I mean, I swore it wasn't going to happen, but here I am, rushing at the end. And I won't ask anybody for a $20 bill. I got enough money up here now. And I had intended to play the last song from Hamilton, which is called Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story? And that's what I'd like you to consider. That song was about who tells the story of Hamilton, but think about it. Who tells the story about our identities, our collective identities, the intersecting collectives to which we belong, collectives based on class, gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, religion. Who writes the stories of those groups? What if those histories are distorted or buried, lost? How would that affect your own identity? So we got this picture of Andrew Jackson, who, by the way, was fit into that mold of self-made man, but we won't talk about him. And you know that sometime in the near future, unless things really get screwed up, that Harriet Tubman's going to replace Jackson on the $20 bill. Well, what difference does it make? Why does that matter? What does it matter that Harriet Tubman is the great from the Underground Railroad? What does it matter that she's there? Well, does this matter? Does it matter that a young black boy can go into the Oval Office and see a president who looks just like him? And what about next week if Hillary Clinton's elected president? I mean, does this matter to young girls? That the woman who would hold the highest, most powerful office in the world is a woman. Does that matter? Well, I think we'd all agree that it does. So in 30 seconds, I'm going to just describe how the histories of those two of the intersecting collective identities of Harriet Tubman were affected and corrected. And this is a picture of W.E.B. Du Bois, in my mind, just an unparalleled American intellectual. He, in 1935, had a long history of writing, and he was one of the founders of the NAACP, the editor of The Crisis, and he was a philosopher and a novelist and just a brilliant man. But he was an historian too, and in 1935, when he surveyed the scene of American history, he saw that the history of African Americans was completely grotesquely distorted. It was written by people who were racists, who believed that blacks were innately inferior, and they wrote the history, and he decided that he was going to correct it. And here, just this quote from Eric Foner, a contemporary historian, who said that the history of Reconstruction was not just an interpretation of history, but it was part of the edifice of the Jim Crow system. It was part of the structure of segregation. So Du Bois wrote a massive magisterial correction of the record called the Black Reconstruction, and in ways that I won't be able to describe today, it corrected the record, and it began, very slowly, but it began a revised and much more honest portrayal of the role of African Americans, African American history, which of course properly is American history. And then just the last is a book that made an incredible impact on me, and that's probably the seemingly unlikely title of The Creation of Feminist Consciousness, written by Gerda Lerner, she passed away in 2013, and she's considered to be the single most influential figure in the development of women's and gender history in the United States. So I learned an enormous amount of women's history from reading just this one book, but I learned more about what it would mean to not have a history, to not have a story to look back at. And she argued that most historians would agree that the memory of things said and done, that's history by women, that recollection began in the 18th century. Not that women hadn't been doing things before. There had been women before who tried to record the ambitions and disappointment of women of their time, but the efforts of those women weren't available to women who came after them. So she described the women's history up until that point as circular. We like to think that history is based on what came before us. We don't start from zero. She said that's just what women were doing, just repeating it over and over until they could learn the story of other women before. And she argues that only after women developed their own history could women overcome an internalized sense of inferiority. Was there any possibility that a sense of sisterhood could grow among women, and with it the possibility of designing and fulfilling alternate visions of the future and for the self? And I'll just put this up in conclusion as you're packing up and getting ready to leave. Is this something I read just the other day that Bruce Springsteen wrote in his autobiography? This isn't from his song, but the autobiography, where he said that history was, and if it's so good enough for the boss, it's good enough for me, that history was a subject that bored me in middle and high school, but I just devoured it now. It seemed to hold some of the essential pieces to the identity questions I was asking. It has for me, and perhaps it will for you. And thank you very much.